Hey you guys, Scott Horton here to remind you that it's fund drive time at the Institute right now. We only do this twice a year, but it's got to be done. And I'm proud to do it too. We've got an incredible crew of the best writers, authors, and podcasters in the libertarian movement. From Jim Bovard, Lori Calhoun, Tom Woods, and Ted Carpenter, to Keith Knight, Kyle Anzalone, Hunter DeRensis, Connor Freeman, and all the rest of the guys. It's the best team around. We've published 3 books this year. Keith Knight's Voluntarist Handbook, Lori Calhoun's Questioning the COVID Company Line, and Joseph Solis Mullins' The Fake China Threat. And here any day now, we will be publishing Thomas E. Wood's Diary of a Psychosis, Jim Bovard's Last Rites, and Keith Knight's latest, Domestic Imperialism. That makes 13 books so far, with more coming in the new year, including my new one, Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine, which I know is already overlong and overdue, but I'm working on it, I promise. And which brings me to the point. We don't have a big glass office building in downtown Washington. The money we raise goes straight to payroll and book production costs, and that's about it. The Libertarian Institute is the best bang for your buck in the movement. If you believe in what we're doing, please go to libertarianinstitute.org/donate for details on how you can help keep us going into the new year and the great kickbacks we offer as well.
And we thank you for your support.
For Pacifica Radio, December the 21st, 2023, I'm Scott Horton. This is Antiwar Radio. All right, y'all, welcome to the show. It is Anti-War Radio. I'm your host, Scott Horton. I'm the editorial director of antiwar.com and the author of Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. You can find my full interview archive, almost 6,000 of them now, going back to 2003, at scotthorton.org and at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show and all your various podcatchers and video sites and so forth. And you can follow me on Twitter, if you dare, at Scott Horton Show. All right, introducing today's guest. It's a great journalist from The Grayzone, Kit Klarenberg. How are you doing, Kit?
How's it going, Scott?
I'm doing real good. I appreciate you joining us on the show here. And you write so much great and important stuff. And I have a book that I've been working on for a very long time now, about the new Cold War with Russia, and you're in it a bunch because I cite you all the time because of all the great work that you do a lot on all different issues, including on Bosnia and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, I got lots of stuff to talk with you about. Let's start with your piece about the 10th anniversary of Obama's overthrow of the government of Ukraine, and how that all came about. And you have an article specifically on the snipers, but let's go ahead and just talk about overall events of 2013 and 14 here and the prequel to the mess we're in now.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the Obama administration, because I think that, yes, while the Maidan, the revolution of dignity or indignity, as is becoming increasingly clear, what did occur under the Obama administration, and indeed it was orchestrated by the National Endowment for Democracy. This is the US's regime change agency. It does overtly what the CIA once did covertly. Its founders are very open about that. This came at a time when the Obama administration was attempting, however poorly, to peacefully coexist with Russia, it was the people pushing for all-out war with the Kremlin were people who were effectively in opposition, like John McCain. However, there is a British role in all of this, which has never been properly investigated or exposed. I'm working on it now, but in effect, there were a large number of British military and intelligence operatives who saw Maidan as an opportunity to effectively do what they did in the wake of World War II and create a banderist state in Ukraine to undermine Russia. There is an individual called Chris Donnelly who he ran an organization called Integrity Initiative. This was a British intelligence black propaganda operation which was concerned with spreading damaging fake news about Russia in order to demonize Moscow in the eyes of Western citizens and diplomatically isolate the Kremlin, therefore leaving them no other option than war in Ukraine. They're very open about this. They stated it on their website that it will be necessary to put pressure on neutrals, quote unquote, and flood the world with propaganda and yes, diplomatically isolate Russia, and then this will lead to war of the old-fashioned sort that the West will inevitably win. These people are completely insane, and we're seeing the failure of their attempt to take down Russia unravel on the fields of eastern Ukraine as we speak. As I noted on Twitter, to the amazement of many, there is currently a Russian government jet parked in Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. This has not been reported on or acknowledged by any of the legacy media because, of course, they don't notice any of these things, or if they do, they know to keep quiet about them. But I strongly suspect that this is the terms of Ukraine's betrayal being dictated to the White House by senior Russian government officials. And given that they are now heading for war in Yemen, I think that that it's going to be a most receptive audience, and Russia's going to probably get given and granted everything that they want. But yes, I mean, the article that you mentioned, this is really quite remarkable. There was a trial in Ukraine which was, at least ostensibly, attempting to get to the truth of what happened in February 2014, when there was a massacre of protesters in Maidan Square. The government of Ukraine, from the word post Maidan, undertook a wide variety of efforts to prevent this being looked at. They deliberately blocked official investigations. They passed laws giving amnesty to all Maidan protesters for any crimes that they may have committed. So I mean, that's basically it was basically a non-starter, but begrudgingly, due to Western pressure, a court case was launched in 2016, and it's just terminated. And the finding was that three Ukrainian police officers were convicted in absentia, i.e., they're not in the country because Zelensky traded them for people held hostage by the Donbass separatists in 2019. That one was convicted of being an accessory, although he was sentenced to time served because he'd effectively been on tag and at liberty, but while being tried. And another police officer was acquitted of all charges. No one was remotely happy or thought credible the findings of the verdict in Ukraine itself. And there were a number of prosecutors stated that yes, it was a total whitewash, and no one's going to be held accountable for this. However, the entire Western media either ignored this finding or reported it as they were all convicted. This is like an outright lie that multiple media organisations told that all of these officers had been convicted. And we're now going to face jail. That's not true. The reality is, and this was spelled out in the million-word long verdict, that actually a lot of shots provably came from Hotel Ukraina, which at the time was a base of operations for Svoboda, which is a far-right Ukrainian neo-fascist party. There are multiple international media sources, both Italian and Israeli documentaries have spoken to two Georgians who claim to have been the snipers on the day, who were posted in Hotel Ukraina by Svoboda and specifically told to shoot protesters to stir up the crowd, because at that time the protests had largely run out of steam. There was an attempt to remove Yanukovych via a vote of no confidence, which failed, and it was effectively there was a risk that he was not going to be successfully overthrown by these street protests. So they just decided, in the manner of so many other US regime change operations, such as in Venezuela and also Syria, the early days of the Syrian revolution. There was snipers picking off protesters to stir up crowds and create tension with authorities. And this is the same thing that happened when Hugo Chavez was temporarily overthrown in Venezuela in 2002. So it's a tried and tested tactic, and it unfolded in Ukraine. Yes, and we are seeing what that created, which was a anti-Russian far-right state, a collapse under the weight of its own contradictions in Ukraine as we speak. It looks like Zelensky and his top general are trying to kill each other at this stage. So there was a recording device was found in Zelensky's office. It wasn't the Russians that put it there, so yes, it is kind of final days. It's Hitler in the Führer bunker, having a meltdown, surrounded by enemies. I think that the terms of the peace, that quote unquote peace, that the US will allow or impose on Ukraine is going to be absolutely brutal. I suspect that the Russians want Kharkiv and Odessa. Putin made this very clear the other day. I mean, the Russians are negotiating from a position of total strength. They have effectively disarmed most NATO member states. They are not running out of missiles. They're not running out of tanks. The sanctions have done nothing. And Ukraine, meanwhile, is mobilizing women because they're rapidly running out of men to throw into artillery fire. So, yeah, I mean, all round, it's a complete disaster. I have been warning people that this is what's going to happen for a very long time. I've largely been laughed at, and I just continue to be vindicated on each and every point. The US withdrawal from Afghanistan provides a very clear blueprint for Ukraine's betrayal. There is a report by the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction on the collapse of the Afghan government, which is very, very interesting. It was released at the start of this year, I believe. It got virtually no, or indeed just simply no media coverage whatsoever. Its contents are fascinating, though, and it's very, very clear that the US was setting up the Afghans for total betrayal. They knew very, very well that the government wasn't going to survive, that the military and security services that they'd spent a very long time constructing at enormous expense to US taxpayers was going to disintegrate like sugar in hot tea the second that they left. And that's exactly what happened. And in an amazing excerpt, Ghani, their puppet in Kabul, was specifically told that by senior US officials that we are leaving, we're leaving, and we're not coming back. And he didn't believe them, because he thought that Afghanistan was so geopolitically significant, and the Americans had expended so much blood and treasure trying to dominate it and create an effective colony there, that they weren't going to leave. So they made no preparations for the eventual departure because they thought it wasn't going to happen, and then it did. And then within the span of a few days, the entirety of the NATO-created Afghan government ceased to exist. It was no longer a thing, and Ghani was on a plane to the UAE, where he's not been heard from ever since. And Afghanistan is effectively not spoken about in the media. Now, this is exactly what's going to happen to Ukraine. I mean, maybe Zelensky will make his way to Miami, or if he's not killed first by one of his inner circle, perhaps with the CIA's direct order. But yeah, people will be amazed at it, much like a shoal of fish moving all at once without apparent direction. Like, the entire media is going to just start looking the other way. I saw today very sad news, actually. There is a website called Open Democracy, which has a Russia desk, a Russia and Eastern Europe desk, which produced some very, very good content and reporting on the ground in Eastern Europe. They're closing down now. And they were funded by George Soros and NED because they don't want people looking at what's happening in Ukraine anymore, because it no longer serves American interest for that to happen.
Yeah. Hey, y'all, Scott here. Let me tell you about Roberts & Roberts Brokerage, Inc. Who knew? Artificial bank credit expansion leads to price inflation and terribly distorted markets. If you've got any savings left at all, you need to protect them. You need to put some, at least, into precious metals. Well, Roberts & Roberts can set you up with the best deals on silver, gold, platinum, and palladium
and they've been doing this since 1977. Hey, if you just need some sound advice about sound money, they're there for you too. Call Tim Fry and the guys at 800-874-9760. That's 800-874-9760, or check them out at rrbi.co. That's rrbi.co. You'll be glad you did.
Hey, y'all, you should sign up for my Substack. It's scotthortonshow.substack.com. And if you do that, you'll get the interviews a day before everybody else. But not only that, they'll be free of commercials. How do you like that? Pretty good, huh? scotthortonshow.substack.com. Hey, y'all, libertasbella.com is where you get Scott Horton Show and Libertarian Institute shirts, sweatshirts, mugs, and stickers and things, including the great Top Lobsters designs as well. See, that way it says on your shirt why you're so smart. Libertas Bella, from the same great folks who bring you ammo.com for all your ammunition needs, too. That's libertasbella.com. All right, it's Antiwar Radio. I'm Scott Horton, talking with Kit Klarenberg. Boy, is he easy to interview. On that last point, I noticed, or somebody else did, and I saw the tweet about it, Kit, that the Washington Post took down their banner headline, or their banner link, the war in Ukraine. Look the other way there. But so we got a lot to go over, but we got to start with you contradicting me, and you're only partially right, but not really. But Barack Obama had a policy of trying to get along with Vladimir Putin, but that's not the same as the Obama administration. And in fact, Robert Perry at Consortium News at the time thought that one of the major impetuses for the neocon policy in Ukraine was to prevent the budding chumminess of Obama and Putin over Syria. If you'll remember, in 2013, Putin and Obama had made a deal that America would destroy all of Syria's chemical weapons in order to stave off the invasion, which Obama didn't really want to do at the time. And so Robert Perry thought that this was one of the main reasons that the neocons did what they did in Ukraine, was just to make sure to nip this coexistence with the Russians in the bud and make sure to stay at opposing force there. And, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? And I don't know enough about this, but John Kerry's name is very absent from the story of the Maidan Revolution. But Vice President Biden's name is right there in the mix, with the lower levels of the State Department led by Victoria Nuland pushing for the regime change there. So it is a very interesting dynamic about what was going on. It looks a lot like insubordination, but Obama's still the man in the chair, and so it's his responsibility if Robert Kagan's wife is getting away with bloody murder on his watch, either way.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that Syria is an interesting one, because I think that Russia effectively preventing a U.S. invasion there. I mean, of course, it's forgotten that Putin brokered the surrender of Assad's chemical weapon stockpiles. And yeah, the neocons were absolutely furious. I mean, and also as well, like, I mean, on the ISIS point, this is it's crazy that people have just forgotten, by and large, forgotten about ISIS. The CIA and MI6 created a mini caliphate that had its own passport and its own currency, and its own license plates, and traded with Western countries as a country. And then when it span out of control, because of course these complete lunatics, the CIA and MI6, had been financing and assisting in getting over to Syria to take down Assad, wanted to take over the world and thought that this was plausible, and were like beheading women and stuff, and it was pretty bad for PR to be associated with them. So yeah, they tried to put the toothpaste back in the tube, and failed miserably. And then Russia came along and destroyed this mini caliphate they'd created. And they were really angry about that, because only they get to destroy the caliphate they created. And I think that also that the American dishonesty and Western dishonesty, and just a bad faith action in Syria was like really convinced Russia that there was no way that they could have a constructive relationship with the West, because they saw the destruction of Yugoslavia in 1999 in an illegal but legitimate was the phrase, but like bombing campaign. They saw them do the same in Libya, and they saw them try to do the same in Syria. They were just the US literally and its international lackeys, particularly Britain, thought that they could just go around the world just overthrowing leaders, destroying countries because they wanted to, or because they were trying to access a country's resources at low cost. And they wouldn't. Russia was not only extremely unhappy about this from a philosophical perspective, but also was extremely worried about the same being done to them. I have Belgrade is a city which, I mean, it's a beautiful part of the world and much under traveled to. But the legacy of the war is still here 25 years on. There are bombed out buildings. It has the highest cancer rates in the world. It has the scars of NATO bombing, remain very, very, very fresh, and people are going to be living with the consequences of that for decades. And it's like why I have a friend here who specifically said to me, I think it was in 2015. He said, well, they're doing to the Russians now what they did to us, which is, yes, like sanctions, relentless demonization in the media, which is like manufacturing consent for destroying them. And Russia had decided it had enough. And lashed back. And I think that, yes, that this is a very interesting point in world history. I mean, the empire is avowedly concerned about all of the money it's spending on missiles to shoot down drones flown by the Houthis, which cost $1,000 to make. They're spending millions to bat away drones. Like, this could turn out into all-out war very, very easily. And I think that if the US is convinced that the Houthis are a soft target, I mean, they're sorely mistaken. They lived under genocidal Saudi bombing for the best part of a decade. Yeah. Targeting fishing boats, targeting markets and churches, just to get them to yield, and they didn't back down.
I know. So hold it right there. I actually just interviewed my buddy Nasser Arabi, a reporter out of Sana'a, all about that. But we got to stick on Ukraine here for a minute because time is short and there's so many topics here. But of course, you're right that this is something, obviously, people got to keep their eye on the threat of regional war there in the Middle East. But I wanted to ask you what you're saying there. But, we skipped almost the whole war all the way to the end where, Ukraine's lost it. And just like you and a lot of people have warned all along that just time and power are on Russia's side here. And that just is what it is. We can throw all the money at it we want. It can only go so far. And all this talk about reclaiming every square inch of the Donbass and all this has always been a fantasy. It was always only the question of, are they really going to keep all 4 provinces or not? But now you're telling me you're certain they're going to demand, I think you said based on something Putin said recently, that you think they're going to demand the city of Kharkiv and Odessa, which they have not taken or even tried. Well, they surrounded Kharkiv there for a while, and then the Ukrainians took that land back in September of 22. But they never have gone so far as to do more than hit Odessa. They haven't landed a force there and attempted to take that land at all. But you're saying you think the Russians are going to demand the entire southern coast, including Odessa, in their terms here?
Oh, of course, absolutely. I mean, I think that Russian leaders are remarkably forthright in terms of setting out what they want and what they're willing to do to get it. When Putin in February 2022, in the days leading up to the invasion, he openly stated what Russia's objectives were in Ukraine, which was of course demilitarization, denazification. But this is something that people rather miss is decommunization, and he explicitly stated that. Ukraine is pulling down all of these statues of Lenin, and they talk about decommunization. And he said, well, that suits us, but you must not stop halfway. And what he meant by that is that there are historically Russian territories in Ukraine which were given to Ukraine by communist leaders. So like Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev all effectively created the modern Ukrainian state. I mean, the very name Ukraine means borderland. Ukraine was the borderland of Russia for centuries, and places like Odessa and Kharkiv are historically Russian. I mean, Zelensky himself couldn't speak Ukrainian before he became president, and there is a large number of people there who see themselves as Russian. And it's one of the reasons that this is perhaps the most widely forecast war in history, because it was well understood that by effectively ending the Soviet Union without any discussion about its borders, of the borders of these new countries that were created by the dissolution of the USSR, that it created all sorts of problems. It effectively created states out of what were administrative units, where arbitrary lines on a map which were related to grain distribution suddenly became binding national borders. This is one of the reasons that the post-Maidan government gave the Kremlin such a fright, was that they immediately, some of their first acts were to rename the road leading up to Baba Yar Stepan Bandera Highway, and also scrap language rights for Russians, which effectively made an enemy or a discriminated against minority out of something like half the population. There are a great many Ukrainians who speak no other language than Russian, and yes, were born in and grew up in lands that were historically, until very, very recently, in the scheme of things, Russian territory. And so, that objective was set out quite clearly before the war started. In a recent speech, Putin referred to Odessa as historically Russian territory, which is as good a signal as any, as that's what they've got their eyes on. Now, an interesting historical precedent for this, which many people might forget, is that the 1995 Dayton Accords, which brought the Bosnian Civil War to a close, in effect, the Bosniaks, the Bosnian Muslims, who the US had been using as a proxy up until that time, and giving and funneling unaccountably vast amounts of weapons and money to in secret and completely illegally, in breach of a UN embargo via CIA black flights. The Bosnian Muslims were expecting the US to effectively back them in the Dayton Accords and give them all of Bosnia's territory and trample over, kind of steamroller over Bosnian Serb and Yugoslav government demands. Right. This belief meant that they refused to engage in peace negotiations throughout the war. There were a number of attempts by the Yugoslav government, by the EU and the UN, to achieve a negotiated settlement, which despite the fact they were losing pretty badly throughout, the Bosnian Muslims refused, because their negotiating position was, we're not giving you an inch, because they thought that NATO bombs would come and then they would get everything they wanted. And as it happened, they got thrown under the bus brutally. The Serbs were given more territory than Slobodan Milosevic considered fair or humane.
Including Srebrenica and Zepa, which in all the previous deals, the Muslims got to keep. But in the final deal, nope, the Serbs get them. And including, of course, the horrible massacre, although it wasn't quite as horrible as they embellished, but pretty close, in Srebrenica to finish that exchange of territory there. It's just a catastrophe. I happen to be writing that part of my book right now. It is.
Oh, really? But it's just insane. That's the thing, is that they got They were expecting all sorts of indulgences and support from the US, which wasn't there. And then the US effectively said to them, well, you have no negotiating position. Your economy is just completely trashed, and
we got an election coming up.
Yeah. And you've got an election coming up, so you have to accept everything that we're imposing upon you, or we're just going to pull out the rug from under you and leave you at the mercy of the Serbs. And in the words of one of the Bosniak negotiators, we signed Dayton with a gun to our heads. And it's like, they had no choice. And it's like, it's exactly the same in Ukraine. Ukraine has been carrying out a silent campaign of shock therapy neoliberalism at US behest. It has destroyed employment rights for the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians. It has privatized, it has made their country safe for BlackRock and Monsanto, as safe as it can be. Now, in that context, the US it needs at least some Ukrainians still alive to allow the economy to function. And it also probably wants to head off future disputes with Russia. So in that context, I think they would be very forthcoming in terms of what they give the Russians. And I've seen many people, again, kind of mock me for suggesting this. If you look at just basic historical precedents, which are very recent, even though nobody's heard of them, of course, the blueprint is there for a mass betrayal. And yes, the Russians have made clear that they're not going to stop fighting until they feel that their demands are met, of course, because this war has been costly for them, but not as costly, anywhere near as costly as the media would have had you believe a few weeks back. Their objectives and their definition of victory has become enlarged, and it's like, I mean, they already, just even the 4 territories that they've formally annexed and they are going to be holding presidential elections in very, very soon. That's not enough for them yet. It is also, they're sitting on 65% of Ukraine's pre-war GDP because there's an enormous amount of resources and there's lots of lithium there and all sorts of like precious metals, and it's not for nothing Ukraine was considered the breadbasket of the Union. Right. So they've got all of that, and Ukraine has nothing. Now, again,
and I'm sorry, we're out of time here, but you're right. I mean, that's always been the question since the war broke out 2 years ago. Are they going to take the whole country, or are they going to leave the land west of the Dnieper River, or they are going to go as far as Odessa or not? And they may have a hell of an insurgency on their hands either way, but hopefully the Americans are heading toward the exits here. But I'm sorry, we're just out of time for the show today. But This is Kit Klarenberg, everybody, at The Grayzone, and he does so much great work over there. You guys have got to keep up with what he's doing. That's thegrayzone.com. Really appreciate your time on the show.
Cheers, Scott. Take care.
All right, you guys, and that is Antiwar Radio for today. I am your host, Scott Horton. Find me at antiwar.com and at scotthorton.org. And Merry Christmas. I'm here every Thursday from 2:30 to 3 on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. See you next week.